Hello there. I'm Elizabeth Corey with beatingtrauma.com, and we're going to talk about trauma today. I actually specifically want to talk about anger because I've been feeling a little bit of that lately, and because actually we all need help with anger, let's face it. After trauma, we tend to really struggle to connect with our anger, really to allow our anger to come forward. So I want to talk about anger today in a way that often is not talked about. I really want to give anger its due, so to speak, because it is a very, very helpful emotion when we use it the right way, which, granted, isn't always easy because society and probably our families of origin as well don't really give us the right tools to understand and use anger the way that it is meant to be. So we had to do a lot of work to get there. But I want to talk a little bit today about what we can do to help ourselves. You'll probably have a hard time staying focused on this particular topic because you'll have parts in your system that are very opposed to anger and expressing anger, which is exactly what I'm talking about. So we have a lot stacked against us when it comes to allowing ourselves to really express anger. So I want to talk about not only that, but why it is critical. I mean, really critical for us to express it. Because, in my opinion, anger that is not expressed is one of the most toxic emotions that we are holding in the body. And it can lead to a lot of illnesses and physical problems and what have you. So we need to make it a priority to let our anger out. But that's going to come with challenges. So that's what I want to talk about, what those challenges may look like, because if you don't know what they look like or you don't see them, you're going to have a really hard time finding them, of course. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that today. Those who've known me for a while know how much I love anger and how important I think it is. So you're probably not surprised to hear any of this. I want to say hi to Amy and Mary and Regina and Sandy. So glad you guys are here. Thank you for joining and saying hello. So let's have a conversation about anger. And I definitely want this to be a conversation. So let me know as we go along what your own experiences are, either with the suppression of anger or the way anger has appeared or the way that you find yourself blocking it, because there's a lot of ways we can do that too. I'm labeling this particular live stream the purpose of anger because it really does have a purpose. And that's kind of the core of what I want to talk about today. But first, I'm going to start by talking about some of the reasons why it's so hard to get at it. Thank you all so much for joining. So, first of all, this is not going to be a surprising statement. Anger is highly stigmatized. As a matter of fact, when it comes to our emotions, and I sort of list there being 5 core traumatic emotions, which are anger, futility, grief, and shame and fear. But anger is probably the most stigmatized of all of the emotions, truthfully. I mean, don't get me wrong, futility can be very stigmatized, but anger really does get a bad rap, when it comes to our need to express it. And that's because, honestly, it often is expressed in really ungrounded ways. That includes in our families of origin, oftentimes, which is why we have so quickly adopted those beliefs about anger, because we've kind of seen it in action ourselves. But what we've generally seen is ungrounded anger. But the world around us likes to stigmatize anger because it keeps the oppressors in charge. So, you may have had a really angry person in your household who was an adult, but yet that person would have been telling you all along that you are not allowed to express it because it's bad when you express it, which, by the way, creates so much confusion because it's like, wait, this person can scream and yell, but I'm not allowed to have anger. Well, that's because you're the oppressed. You're not the oppressor. The oppressor is allowed to have anger. The oppressed are not. That's how it works. And this happens at a family level, and this happens at a societal level as well. So the stigmatization of anger is meant to keep the oppressed, generally speaking, across the board. And so that's why we have this desire, societally speaking, to suppress anger. It's not because it's actually dangerous. It's because of what it could potentially do, which is make a whole lot of change happen in a way that doesn't help out people who are on the more powerful end of society as a whole, right? Like, so that's why there is so much opposition to anger in the world around us. And typically people who are oppressed and do express anger are stigmatized and labeled for doing it. So Janet is saying, I don't know how to have controlled anger, so I just stuff it and pretend it doesn't exist. Yes. And let me just say that one of the best tools for anger and like kind of being able to, what I won't call it controlled anger, what I'll call it is like channeled anger, is writing. This is honestly, it's one of the most beneficial things we could do with anger, is to express it through writing. That writing isn't going to look pretty. It may even be that you take the pen or the pencil and you just drag it along the page. It might not even be actual words all the time. I often tell people if they're anger writing on a computer, if they've got a laptop, for example, they may want to get one of those keyboards that plugs in that doesn't cost very much money, because just in case, you're slamming on the keys. That's all good. Do it. Have at it. We really need to express it. Combining writing with some physical activity that helps pull the anger up, the writing will then release that anger from the system. That's one of the most controlled, best ways that I've found to express anger. And believe me, I've expressed a lot of it. And I'll tell you, everything's on the table. All the curse words. I always tell all my clients, all the curse words, like Regina's saying, I curse and write ugly things. Yes, you need to. Here's the thing, you don't have to share that with anybody. And if you're concerned about the safety of your whatever you're writing is, then you don't have to keep it when you're done. You can destroy it. Or you can put a password on a file on your computer. I highly, highly, highly recommend writing from anger. It's really, truly is one of the best things that we can do for ourselves. So, let's see. Oh, lots of good comments coming in. Janet's saying sometimes writing doesn't cut it, though. And that's when I recommend bringing in like some kind of physical activity too. I used to plant my feet and punch the air over and over and over again. And believe me, there could be a lot of anger here. One of the big keys to our anger is to stay as grounded as possible, because that's when it gets us out of our mind. A lot of times when we're writing from anger, we're actually writing from a loop in the head, like the cognitive mind. That's actually not the most helpful writing. You write from it, but it just keeps spinning because it's up here. We want to get into the body. And a lot of times what helps us with that is doing something physical. Either a lot of times before we write, not always, but that can be really helpful. So really work on grounding if you're feeling like all you're doing is spinning in your writing, because in that case you probably are spinning. It's the mind, what I call often the spin cycle. So the mind just kind of going around and around and around about something that you're angry about, oftentimes more present day. A lot of times I find that the loops we get into are more about something going on right now. If we ground, we can often get at the underlying reason we're angry, which honestly is going to be often about childhood. Sandy's talking about axe throwing. I would love to try that. I'm also concerned about my level of coordination, but I think it sounds really cool. There are lots of those places where you go and you break things. I'm a big fan of that idea. Huge fan. I think anything that helps us is fantastic. And Regina's talking about mending a fence and just being able to like pound into that fence. Absolutely. Yeah. Lynn's talking about scrubbing the shower. Yeah. This morning, because I feel a lot of anger right now. And this morning I was scrubbing my stovetop and I was just like, I mean, really scrubbing. My stovetop is super clean at the moment because, I really put in the elbow grease and that kind of thing helps a lot. So you can find a million different ways to get physical with your anger. But one of the keys to that is grounding. When you're getting physical, be in the body, and that physicality helps you do that. And then, right, you're going to get a lot more core emotion that you can then release as opposed to kind of that mind loop writing, which does happen. And so we have to kind of watch for that too. So great conversation about anger already. I'm definitely hitting on a topic that you guys can relate to, and that's understandable, right? And Tony is saying, I want to learn to trust myself to believe that expressing my feelings is safe and a better route than suppressing. Yes, it's hard. It takes time to learn that. We have to do it little bits at a time, especially with something like anger. I'll also say that it's important to note that as you express anger, as Regina is saying, it does have a tendency to open up that gateway to our grief. Anger and grief are very tied to each other. So there is always a benefit to getting to anger. The other thing anger really does for us is it brings about clarity. Grief also does that. So these are two big emotions for connecting us with our clarity and really understanding our truth, which is another reason that we will often have inner defenders that try to block it because we're not kind of allowed to know that. So let's see. Yeah, Janet, I would definitely do the axe throwing in a more supervised setting. I mean, hey, if you're really good with axes, I guess you don't have to. For me personally, I would need to go to one of those places that does it, which they're growing, There's a reason they're growing, guys. So let's see. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference. Janet's LOLing. Everybody be safe out there. But I want to talk a little bit about the difference between ungrounded and grounded anger, because ungrounded anger is where the stigma comes from, right? Like that's what started all the reasons we hate anger is because of ungrounded anger. And ungrounded anger is suppressed anger. So that's the anger that we're constantly pushing down. Because until we express that ungrounded anger, we can't connect with our more grounded anger, which is honestly what we need. It's a part of having a good life is to have grounded anger. And I'm going to talk about why a little bit more in just a second. But until we connect with that ungrounded anger, which, yes, is scary, we really can't get to that grounded anger, which is ultimately a guidance system for us. It's very, very important. We're supposed to be connected with it. Not surprisingly, our oppressors don't want that. So what ends up happening is we're suppressing it. And when we're suppressing it, it usually leads us to some pretty heavy anxiety, especially if the anger is triggered, and emotional invalidation, which is a re-traumatization. So as we invalidate our own emotions, we are re-traumatizing ourselves. So very, very important for us to be able to notice how we're suppressing ourselves. That is just so important for us. Let's see. All right, just kind of looking at some of these. Yeah, and so I'm missing part of the conversation here that Amy mentioned something, I'm guessing, about anger being a secondary emotion, and Pam was commenting on that. I will say that this is very, very true, that anger and futility in general are something I call a defensive emotion. They are always blocking another emotion underneath them. Okay. It doesn't make them less important. Like anger is not less important because it's a defensive emotion or it is sometimes referred to as a secondary emotion. It's still critical that we express it, but there's going to be an emotion underneath it. So as you're expressing anger or futility, there will be something that lives beneath it that's trying to express. So a lot of times that's, grief, as I was saying earlier, right? It can also be fear. It could be shame. There could be a lot of different things that live under the anger. But yes, there is something underneath it. But what a lot of people will say to me is they'll say, okay, well, if it's like a defensive emotion or a secondary emotion, that means I don't have to feel it. I just have to get at what's underneath it. And that's not true. You do have to feel it. As you feel it, you will get to what's underneath it, but you do have to also let the anger express. So that's my feeling on the whole anger secondary emotion thing. It absolutely is that. It is that kind of defense. It's like a layer on top of something else, just like futility is. But you still have to feel. Believe me, I have a lot of people who are like, oh, I can get out of it then. I'm like, no, you can't. And I'll be honest, there's a lot of it there for us. For those of us who've been through trauma, there's a lot of anger and rage, like some really intense stuff there. And that doesn't make us bad or wrong or all the things that our controller or our karma kid might try to tell us. Of course we have all this anger there. We have been mistreated over and over and over and over again for a very long time. This is normal, right? So I really want to stress that. So as we channel this ungrounded anger through all of these amazing tools we've talked about today, as well as writing, don't forget the writing, we can begin to connect with our more grounded anger. And I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of that, because that's really where we can start to make some very big differences in our lives. The first one is that anger tells us something is not right. Something's wrong in our current lives when we're in grounded anger. And I like to refer to this kind of anger as self-love. This is the anger that says, nope, this isn't how we're supposed to live. This isn't the behavior we're supposed to accept. This isn't okay for us. So that's ultimately self-love. So when people say to me, oh, anger is bad, I say, no, anger is telling you that something isn't okay as it stands right now. That's incredibly powerful. And so I do like to stress to people, like, when you're in a place where you're potentially sacrificing a lot, like, you're giving up for yourself in order to make other people happy, you may actually be expressing, or you may actually have, I'll say, a tremendous amount of anger under the surface that needs to express, truly. And it's in expressing that anger that you can begin to discover how you are not really, being good to yourself, taking care of yourself, supporting yourself in that particular moment. So anger is here to tell you something's not right. So when you start to feel it, and you may start to write from more of the ungrounded anger, you will ultimately get to the anger that says something here in this situation has to change. Which brings us to the second purpose of grounded anger, which is to set boundaries. Now, a lot of us have been taught that boundaries are not okay, that boundaries are selfish, that setting a boundary makes us selfish. We learn to feel guilty for setting boundaries, but anger is what brings us to those boundaries. And believe it or not, I'm going to reframe this a little bit. Compassionate or boundaries are extremely compassionate to others. So what it teaches others is how they can navigate relationships with us. As opposed to what a lot of us do in relationship after trauma, which is to expect people to literally read our minds. This actually helps people to know what's acceptable for us and what isn't. It actually is us saying that we want to invest in this relationship. This relationship's important enough for us to say, hey, that's not okay with me, or there needs to be a different way of interacting because I want the relationship to last. So I'm telling you how to help make that happen. It's actually quite a vulnerable thing to do and highly compassionate. And by the way, also incredibly important for children because they don't know what the, guideposts are unless we tell them. So reframing anger, but also reframing boundaries and the way we look at those things is a very important part of our recovery. We do need to do that. Boundaries are highly compassionate, and I have always found them to be easiest to set when there's a relationship that's very important to me. Much harder to do when I'm not as interested in the long-term relationship. So what that tells me is boundaries are for the special people in my life, right? So keep thinking about it a little bit like that, as opposed to this idea that a boundary is selfish, because the reality is if we don't set the boundary, we're likely to just get angrier and angrier and angrier until we're out, right? And that's, if you don't want that to happen, that's why the boundaries can be so incredibly important. So I am a super big fan of boundaries, and you will hear me talk about it a lot. Regina is saying, my boundaries freak out everyone around me. What? I have a need, not me, in their eyes, but I keep on regardless of anxieties. And I will say that a lot of times the people who have been in our lives before we set boundaries are not always going to be the people who respond well to our new boundaries, because these are people that didn't like boundaries in the first place. A lot of times they're the very people that taught us not to set boundaries, right? So I will say that boundaries aren't always going to be, met with, the acceptance. But a lot of times boundaries can be, when we set a boundary or attempt to set a boundary, it can be a way of determining whether this relationship will actually be able to be respectful at some point. And if it can be, it may be worth saving. If the other person is always going to push against our boundary or disrespect it or say it's unacceptable, what we're learning there is this isn't really a long-term option for us as far as a relationship is concerned. Hard to learn, especially when we have that love seeker in there telling us we don't want anyone to abandon us. But sometimes we may have to go ahead and say this relationship is not one that I can make boundaried, and therefore I cannot continue to engage with this person in my life. Very, very important for us to learn. And that's what anger is trying to tell us. That grounded anger is saying, this person really isn't very good for you, right? And that can be an excellent thing for us. The last one I wanted to talk about as far as the purpose of the grounded anger, although I did mention another one earlier, and I'll reiterate that afterwards, which is that grounded anger lets us know when justice is needed. And when I talk about justice here, I'm not necessarily talking about something legal, but a lot of times we take that grounded anger that we're using to protect ourselves and we begin to project that out into the world. This is a positive projection. Project that out into the world to make a bigger change happen, more in a global or societal fashion, where it's okay, we've got the oppressed, we've got the oppressor. We're starting to see that more clearly because we're seeing how the ways in which we were oppressed, and we're starting to stand up to our own oppressor, which makes us much more likely to then be able to bring that to society as a whole and start seeking justice in the world. That's why I'm so devoted to this work on an individual level, because I know that as we begin to process our own anger and find the ways that we are personally dealing with oppression and healing that and standing up against that, we begin to also be able to do that as a community, as a society, as a globe, and really make grounded justice happen in the world around us. So that's the beauty of this inner work. And that's, why I never shut up about it, because every person who makes these changes individually is going to be contributing to a much bigger change in the world around us. And let's face it, we need more of that, right? We definitely need more of that. So this is good for us getting to that place. And then I will just kind of mention what I mentioned earlier, which had I remembered it when I was doing my outline, it would have probably been the fourth one here, which is that grounded anger brings clarity. And I was talking about this earlier because anger is what helps us to understand what our story is, what we really need to do in our lives to speak our truth and stand in our truth as much as possible. And when that anger is, connected to grief, it can be related to other emotions as well. But when it is connected to grief is also a huge emotion for clarity within as well. So between those two emotions, we usually can make some pretty huge realizations when we embrace it. So to me, those are some of the biggest purposes associated with grounded anger. But oh my gosh, there are so many. And so don't believe the hype when people tell you that anger is not a good idea, right? Because that's so not true. It's about the way we approach the anger and the way we approach expressing from the anger that really matters. Channel it to the page. Make sure you're grounded so you're not, writing in that loop that I talked about earlier. Find something physical. You guys all had amazing ideas today for that. And there's a million others as well. But find something physical that really works for you. And partner that with the writing. Because the physical will bring the anger up and the writing will help release it from the system. Because until an emotion has been heard, it doesn't leave. So we want to bring it up and then we want to move it out. And that's what those two things will help you do. Kind of partnering those two things together can really be beneficial for us. Let's see. Regina is saying, I always feel grounded when I begin to release in tears. Yes. Well, and that, as we've been talking about, that does often happen, right? It's like as you as you're feeling the anger, the tears will often show up. And that's something I've been teaching to my kids too. They'll be angry and I'm like, let's express the anger. And then because they're kids and they don't have the same level of defenses, usually within minutes they're crying about something. It's so fast. Not so fast for me. Maybe not so fast for you. Our defenses are a bit stronger, but it's interesting to kind of watch how they're able to move between the two emotions, and definitely confirms the theory that there's a relationship, no doubt. Janet is saying, I need to listen to this again and take notes. This is a hard one because we often have some very, very devoted defenders to the blocking process here with anger. It's actually why sometimes we will have some really strong anger turn inward, because that's actually your angry parts getting mad at the internal parts that are blocking them. So that can also make for some good writing as well, because we do want to embrace these parts that are angry, because ultimately they mean very well. They are trying to bring us back to the self-respect we deserve, the self-compassion we deserve. And they can't do it unless we hear them right. It is. Oh, I know. This is a lot of info. I actually was going to target this to be a little more specific. And then as we got into it, I'm like, let's just talk about all of it. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. This was a great topic. You guys were We're super participatory. I know I didn't get to that many of the comments, but I appreciate all of that. And I look forward to talking to you guys again next Tuesday with yet another topic about trauma and our healing. And you guys are doing an amazing job. I look forward to talking to you very soon.